Friends, here we go. Kinesiology 223, chapter 12. We're still talking psychological skills training. This is presentation 8, and it's a beefy one, so I'm going to jump right in. With this slide, we did this last presentation. We had these 5 main aspects, and the book lists these 5 main aspects to implementing PST. And the last presentation, we did the first 2. Now this one, we're going to work on these 3. Now the book outlines these, and they note that they shouldn't be mutually exclusive, but they're kind of like an integrated process with one another. And for this to be a highly functioning process, you need communication, you need implementation, and evaluating the efficacy is also part of this, which we'll see in a second. So let's jump into this. So this model that's provided by the book and they present here, and I like this because they talk about it's a model that emphasizes the development of mental skills to achieve performance success as well as personal well-being. And what I like about this is so often, and we've seen this over the last couple of years, this kind of push, even in Olympic level athletes, where they've talked about like the mental toll it takes to compete at such a high level. And these people are operating at a very high level. They're multi-medal winners. And they're talking about their own personal well-being, their psychological and emotional health. And they're talking about the tax that they pay as a result of their drive and their focus to perform. And by tax, I'm not talking about paying the IRS. I'm talking about the psychological and emotional tax that they have. And I think it's been a great shift in that area where people are more open and talking about, look, sometimes you have to talk with a sports performance coach. Sometimes you need to have the ability to just put it down for a couple hours to be able to not have your life be dictated by your training schedule. Anyways, what I like about this though is they talk about that balance between performance success and personal well-being. I think that is of great benefit here. And they note that you have these mental skills that are important for this. And they emphasize the following: foundational skills, performance skills, personal development skills, and team skills. With foundational skills, it's the skills that the person has. They're intrapersonal resources that are basic, the basic mental skills that a person has to succeed. And these are the drive to achieve, the self-awareness regarding their psychological and emotional well-being, also the physiological side as well, productive thinking. We talk about positive self-talk versus negative self-talk, and then also self-confidence, the ability to know and understand that they can be successful and go out and win in a particular competitive environment is a self-confidence, be the ability to achieve or complete a skill successfully. The next up is performance skills. And performance skills, I have difficulty differentiating performance skills on the mental side as well as the physiological side, just because they're so intertwined. There's no doubt there's an interrelatedness between those. But let's just talk about it from the concept of psychological side and psychological skills training. It's the mental abilities that are critical for the execution of skills during the sports performance. So notice how they talk about the execution of skills during sports performance. That's that kind of like a physiological side, but it's being driven by the mental and psychological side. So it's tough to differentiate these because it's hard to not have one without the other. And we've talked about how a person can have like a high anxiety state and it causes physiological responses that are negative to the psychological state, and vice versa. We talked about that in previous chapters a couple times. And in terms of the ability to manage one's energy, the ability to have good attentional focus, but I would even put in the word situational focus, to be able to be highly focused on the task at hand and be aware of the situation and where to train one's focus is key. And then perceptual motor skill, there's a constant feedback loop that happens with your body where you're trying to perform a skill and you have greater proprioception in terms of your balance and coordination, but there's also a perceptual component to this where as the person who's performing the skill, you have a perception of whether or not you perform a skill correctly. I don't know how many times I've worked with an athlete and I'd said, that's a great job doing that skill. Okay, where did you really excel? And the athlete will tell me A, B, C. And it's like, okay, where do we have the greatest area of opportunity? And because they have a good athletic IQ as well as emotional IQ, they can handle that question and know that they can find areas of opportunity and refine that movement pattern. And it's the kinesthetic awareness, right, and the proprioceptive awareness, but it's also the perception in terms of their ability to compare what is optimal versus their performance and try to close that gap between those two. It's really the cool part of coaching when you work with higher end athletes. So personal development skills, mental skills that represent significant maturization. And when you talk about maturing athletes, when you work with athletes who come in as like a freshman in high school and then they're a senior, I just had the opportunity to go back and visit with some of the athletes that I had as freshmen who are now seniors, and wow, to see them and how they've grown up physically, but also just to have a quick, a couple minute conversation with them and see how their headspace and listen to how their headspace has changed over the last couple of years from a freshman to a senior. It was really cool and rewarding to see. And many times, it becomes a matter of just having better understanding of things they want to achieve, and then also a greater competency, right, to be able to achieve those skills. And it becomes a bit of a learning process in terms of here's what I want to achieve, here's I'm going to go ahead and achieve those things. Great, here's what I'm going to achieve, here's I'm going to achieve those things. And it becomes this competency where the person has a better understanding of self and the things that they're able to utilize to their advantage to basically achieve things within the context of their athletic ability. Now, team skills are collective qualities of a team that can be instrumental to the effective team climate. I agree with this. When you have a team of athletes, you kind of are at the mean. Think back to Coach Saban when he was talking about, mediocrity doesn't work, especially when you have a bunch of high achievers. If you have a team of high achievers, that raises the bar and raises the average across the board. That entire team are all high achievers. And quite frankly, probably all of them have the capability to be leaders. But invariably what happens is, even in that environment, people have the ability to rise to the top, as they say, the cream of the crop rises to the top. But it does create, when you have people who are all on the same page, you have better team cohesion and better team confidence, because the team knows that they can go out and physically dominate their opponent. That's part of the process. But I will say this, you look at the collective qualities of a team, they are made up of the individual qualities of the different teammates. Let me go back to this. And you can just think this terms in terms of how they're kind of interrelated in terms of somebody needs the performance skills and the foundational skills to be able to become better as an athlete, to then be better in terms of knowing who they are and what they want to achieve, and then how that plays out into actual team skills going forward. All right, so with this, when you design a schedule, they have a couple different suggestions here. I'm going to tuck myself down here. They talk about how a coach can view this process as ongoing and multifaceted, and I do agree with this. You could have your heavy lifting done during the off season, and then you have a little bit of a drip campaign going on during the season. You can have informal meetings where you pull people out of drills. You can have people, you pull them to the side and you talk about where was their headspace when they were shooting that shot or when they were doing a particular activity. And it could be strategy based, but it could also be psychological skills training based. It can happen at practice. You can be like on the bus or the plane driving or flying to your game, or even meals when you're sitting there talking. I would also say, like, if you're in a college program and you're traveling and you're staying overnight for a game, you can have a team meeting that night, and sure, you can talk about things like strategy and defense and offense, but also that's an opportune time to have like a team bonding time and spend time with your athletes to talk about PST strategies that can help them. And it can be one of your drips, if you will, that's during the season, that instead of being like a 5 minute, maybe it's a 15 or 20 minute as part of a context of a bigger team meeting that you're doing in the hotel. Very common to have that happen. But they list, before or after practice, 1 or 2 days a week might serve. It could be a formal setting, could be or it could be a formal meeting time for educating participants on various other psychological skills. I agree with this, but I do agree that should be shorter, frequent meetings than as opposed to longer, less frequent. But I have to say this though, when they talk about this as a periodization schedule, it's great. I think it has its place. Periodization is a systematic manipulation of rep and set combinations and loading parameters to get the best training response out of your athletes. It's sport specific, don't get me wrong. But the other goal of periodization is to reduce the likelihood of overtraining and reduce the likelihood of injury to the athlete as a result of overtraining. So I like this in terms of periodization, where you're mapping out how you're going to go ahead and integrate in maybe a bigger, beefy, heavy lifting kind of meeting, if you will, during the off season. You might have one at a travel. You might have one at an overnight, when you travel to a game. And then you just might have these quick little drips that you do during the season. I agree with it. I like it. I think it's a great concept. But I will say this. I definitely believe this, and I know the NCAA supports this in terms of practice time. We have a limit in terms of coaching, how much you can actually have practice time with your athletes in season and off season. There are limits, don't get me wrong. And I think, and my own personal belief, there are times where an athlete should be off limits to the coach. And I don't mean like per the NCAA, but I mean when you're talking this type of psychological emotional training, I mean you're talking about a type of skill training that requires the athlete to be self-reflective and take time to think for themselves and kind of really evaluate themselves. If you're a coach that's constantly pinging them on their phone or barking at them all the time in practice, or you're asking them how you feeling today, those are all appropriate, don't get me wrong, but you have to give your athletes the time to process and think through the very things you're trying to implement. Otherwise, they will lose their effectiveness. They'll just give you an answer to basically shut you up as a coach. So there are times when the athletes, I believe, should be off limits within this process. If we go ahead and take this a step further, we go ahead and look at evaluating the program. You have to evaluate the efficacy of all components of your sport, whether it's strategies in a game or practices. And the evaluation itself provides feedback. The feedback itself should be something where it's subjective and objective. And in a certain regard, you're going to have coaches who are not humble enough to objectively evaluate their own strategy and alter as needed. There's stubborn coaches who will believe that their way is the best way and won't even put in place psychological skills training. They'll just punt on the whole thing. But I would tell you, if a coach is open-minded, humble enough, and has a strong enough ego, they can hear the feedback, both verbal and nonverbal, from their athletes in the program to be able to really evaluate their strategies and see if they're effective or not. There's certain performance data you can use, how well a basketball player shot their free throws. You can have conversations with your athletes in terms of how they felt while they were shooting their free throws. When you have these individuals who come in and implement strategies with your teams, it takes away from practice time, and you may have to find a balance in there. But sometimes that consultant might be somebody on staff, and the book makes these points in terms of, was enough time allotted to practice the psychological skills? Was a consultant available? Was a consultant knowledgeable? Should anything be added or deleted from the program? What were the major strengths and weaknesses of the program? And these are all valid questions. But again, if it's somebody where one of your coaches on staff is implementing, the coach has to be strong enough willed to be able to implement the program, but also strong enough ego, if you will, or humble enough ego, to be able to give feedback that might not be so flattering. If they hear back that, quite frankly, that no, it wasn't that great. No, you need to change this. That you need to be able to make those changes for the betterment of your program, big picture. I'm going to jump into this. Common problems with implementing PST. You have lack of conviction, lack of time, lack of sports knowledge, and lack of follow-up. They do it from a consultant standpoint, and consultants have to have a strong enough will to be able to implement their philosophies into a program. And it's with the coach, but also one-on-one with the athletes. With lack of time, coaches frequently claim there isn't enough time, but as we've talked about, you can implement in different strategies for PST, to have a drip campaign, to have your athletes really do this in an ongoing format. With lack of sports knowledge, if you're a consultant who can actually talk about the sport, it certainly helps. You can give different feedback points that are specific to the sport. That absolutely helps. And usually, again, it's a coach that does this, so it's not an issue. And lack of follow-up. There has to be follow-up with the athletes, there has to be follow-up with the coaches, and there has to be follow-up in terms of the efficacy of the program. All right, guys, I got to punch out on this one and move on to the next one. Thank you so much.